Hey, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how I built this home office slash gaming desk, which comes with a ton of useful built-in features to improve usability and keep things clean and tidy. As usual, I'm going to explain the idea behind this design a little bit first, and then we'll get into building. The thing that drove me to design a custom desk was mostly that my old desk setup was much too small to store all of my stuff and always looked pretty messy due to the non-existent cable management. Of course, I could have just bought a bigger desk, but instead I decided to try and design a much more specialized piece of furniture that solves a lot of my desk-related problems all at once, and here's the result. The biggest difference compared to a normal desk is that this has an integrated shelf on top, which solves my storage problem and provides a place to put my 3D printer. The desk also has its own back wall, and that allows you to install both the monitor and speakers directly to it, so they can just float over the desktop, which frees up the entire workspace, and the back wall also helps managing and hiding all the cables. Then there's also an integrated shelf underneath where the PC can live. And my favorite feature of all is this huge cable tray underneath the tabletop, which can be used to store all of your power strips, cables, power bricks and whatever else you might want to hide. And the best thing is that you don't have to crawl underneath the desk to get to it, because it can be accessed from the top by opening this lid in the back, which also doubles as a space to install USB hubs and power outlets. The table is based around a steel frame, mostly just because I like welding a lot more than I do woodworking, but also because, as someone who moves apartments way too often, another important aspect was to allow this thing to be taken apart for transport. And for that reason, the frame consists of several individual pieces that are held together by a few screws, so it can be completely disassembled into manageable pieces when it needs to move to another place. Here's the main materials for the frame. It's mostly steel square tubing and some flat bars, so pretty basic stuff and actually not too expensive. Since I completely planned this build in CAD beforehand, I knew exactly which workpieces I would need, so the first step was to cut and drill all of the individual steel pieces for the frame. When fabricating this kind of thing, it's always a good idea to try and drill all the holes before welding, when the individual parts are still easy to handle, especially if you have a drill press. You're gonna get more accurate holes than with a handheld drill, but it can also save you a bunch of work. For example, with the symmetrical pieces, this allows you to drill 2 of them at once, which makes it twice as fast and also makes sure the holes are lined up. I'm also doing some weld prep here. A lot of people skip this, and sometimes I do it too, but it actually helps the quality of your welds quite a bit if you clean off the rust in mill scale and chamfer the ends of the tubing. So here's all of the individual pieces laid out. It's a bit tedious to prepare all this stuff, but it saves quite a bit of time overall when you're not going back and forth between cutting and drilling and welding. And now we can just get to the fun part, which is welding up all the parts, starting with the first leg piece, which is just a simple rectangle. So I'm using my welding table to make all of this a bit quicker and easier, and at the risk of repeating myself, I just say this again: just because I have some fancy tools doesn't mean they're strictly necessary to build this. I have definitely done some projects where you need fancy tools, but this is not one of them. All you would need for this project in terms of major tools is some way to cut metal tubing, a welding machine, some kind of drill, an angle grinder, and maybe a circular saw or track saw for the wooden parts. And then anything on top mostly just makes things more convenient and sometimes quicker, but a lot of the stuff I use can be replaced with patience or skill. For the inside corner welds, I actually like to put this type of thing in a vise, because that way you can orient the joints so that you can weld them horizontally instead of vertically, which usually gets you a better result, especially with TIG. Next piece is the other leg, which also includes the shelf for the PC. The ends of 2 of these pieces need to be capped, and to do that I figured I can just use some of these cut-offs from the same tubing. They're a bit easier to weld than just a flat piece, and after welding them on I can just cut off the excess here and then grind the edges a bit to make it look nice. Now I'm welding on some tabs that will hold the board for the shelf, and then these pieces get attached to the long piece. I already welded up the outside frame here, so now I can add these two together while making sure the shelf ends up parallel to the ground. Next up are these upper side pieces which hold the shelf and the back wall. And once again there's two tubes with an open end, so I'm using the same technique as before to put caps on them. Most of these pieces are just steel rectangles, which means it's relatively simple stuff in terms of welding it up, which is why I'm not going into huge detail about the fabrication process here. This project definitely involves a pretty big volume of work, but none of it is super complex or requires special tools, so if you have the patience to see it through, I think this could be built by most intermediate hobby makers in something like a garage shop. Next up is this cross brace, and this part serves two purposes. First, it stiffens out the whole frame sideways and holds the back panels, but also this slot in the middle is designed to be the base for a sort of modular attachment system, which allows you to install different things to the back wall of the desk, and it also provides a way to route cables behind the back, and you'll see how all that works in detail a bit later. Next up is the frame for the shelf, which is just another rectangle, so let's not spend too much time on that. With all the frame pieces done, I did some cleanup, mostly grinding the weld smooth in some of the more visible areas. And since I don't like that flap disc look, I also used the Scotch-Brite pad to kind of blend in the areas where I used the grinder, and this also makes the surface look less shiny and a bit more uniform. So with that, the main frame pieces are actually already finished, which means we can do a little test assembly to see if everything fits together. And at this point the whole thing is actually still relatively manageable in terms of weight, because it's just a desk and I didn't use any heavy gauge tubing. Next are going to be some small additions to the frame, starting with these pieces that will hold up the tabletop. And I also decided to add leveling feet just in case, so I did eventually end up drilling a few holes after welding. Next up is something pretty tedious but necessary. I have to add a bunch of small tabs to the back, which will hold the back panels. But there's actually a trick I've used before to make this a little bit faster. After cutting all these little pieces on the bandsaw, I simply put a stack of them in the vise and temporarily weld them together on one side. And this way I can now handle them as one piece, so I only have to drill once instead of 8 times. And then I just grind the weld down until I can plug these apart and do a bit of finishing, and that way I end up with a whole bunch of these relatively quickly. Next are the back panels, and there's actually a lot of options here on how you can make these. As you saw in the beginning, I decided to just stick audio foam panels on there, which is why I'm using some very cheap thin plywood as a backing material, since it's not going to be seen and it isn't important structurally. But you could also use a different material for the back panels according to your taste. Since this desk is supposed to come apart for transport, I'm using these threaded inserts for all the wooden parts. Since if you screw into the wood directly a few times, it might eventually wear out to the point where the screws wouldn't hold anymore. And with these you can take it apart a lot of times. And now for the foam. Even though it has some good properties for recording audio like I'm doing right now, I actually mostly picked this stuff for the back panel because I just like how it looks, and I wanted something with an interesting texture instead of just an empty smooth back wall. The stuff is fairly inexpensive online and easy to cut just using a sharp box cutter. I'm using spray adhesive to glue these onto the boards, and to make sure they go on straight, I glue on one half first and then the other one. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any place that sells these in large enough sheets to do the whole back panel with one piece, so I had to use 2 pieces for each panel, and I tried to line up and hide the seam in the middle as best as possible, but unfortunately it's still kind of visible, which actually bugs the perfectionist in me quite a bit, but I also didn't think it's worth scrapping the whole thing over, so I'm just gonna live with it for now. Next up is finishing the shelf, so I'm cutting the board for that, and I always get a lot of questions about this material because it seems to be very uncommon in the US. It's basically a high quality plywood that is laminated on both sides with a very durable surface, which is also waterproof, and it comes in different colors, but this dark brown is the most common one, and I think it actually fits quite well with the look of this desk. This board just drops into the shelf frame, and it's going to be held by these strips of flat bar that I'm going to weld on. And since I want this to sit perfectly flush with the top of the frame, I'm using a sacrificial cutter from the same material as a spacer. I'm only placing a few tack welds because it's going to be enough to hold some static weight. So even though there's some smoke here, the board isn't actually getting burned too bad. Now we can install this into the frame again, and with that the major parts are finished, but as you probably noticed there's a little thing missing, which is the tabletop. So I don't consider myself much of a woodworker, but a friend of mine happened to have a whole stack of oak slabs in his workshop, and I kind of got talked into making a nice solid oak tabletop instead of just using plywood like I was going to. So this footage is actually not from my own shop, and if you've watched any woodworking content on YouTube at all, you've probably seen this process of milling crooked rough wood into nice straight wood at least 100 times. So I'm not going to go over this in huge detail, but now you know how I ended up with these nice looking slabs of oak here. Another process you might have seen 100 times is gluing something like this together to make a tabletop, but you probably never saw anyone use a welding table to do it. But it turns out it's pretty much the perfect tool for that too. In retrospect, I should have put something between the table and the boards here, because as I learned later, there's some weird chemical process that happens when oak and glue and metal come in contact. And among other things, it turns the wood glue black for some reason, but as you'll see, it ended up not being a big deal. After gluing and cutting it to length, there comes another YouTube favorite, which is sanding shots. Needless to say, this took forever because oak is pretty hard, but I ended up getting all of the weird looking glue sanded out. On the front side, I decided to keep the live edge, which obviously is a matter of taste, and I'm sure many people won't like it because it's a bit overdone, but like I said, I don't do much woodworking, so when I do, I figure I might as well have some fun with it, and at least it's not an epoxy table. I started preparing the edge by knocking off all the loose bits with a wire wheel, and then I went to town with the sander again, making it smooth but trying to keep the original flow of this edge. And personally, I quite like the result. The edge has a nice flow to it, and it just feels good to run your hands over it and kind of breaks up all the boxy shapes of the table a little bit. And then after some more sanding, I finished the tabletop with Danish oil. The reason being, it's just what I happen to have in the shop. I applied this on all sides and then let it dry for one night, and I think I applied 3 coats in total. And for the last step, the tabletop also gets the same inserts so that it's easy to install. Now we can finally bring this to the table, and all of a sudden it's actually starting to look like something, and the sun's coming out too. While I was at it, I also prepared the board for the computer shelf, which is made from the same piece of wood, so it gets the same treatment. Next I'm going to make the cable tray that goes on the bottom. I planned this thing to be pretty big on purpose so that there's enough space in there for lots of cables and power strips and whatever else you might want to hide. And this is also the reason I chose this perforated aluminum sheet for the material, because this allows for good airflow, so things are less likely to overheat in there. I cut this piece a bit larger than it needs to be, because before bending the actual shape, I'm going to fold over the edge to create a rounded edge. I'm just doing 2 90-degree bends, and this thin sheet, it's fairly easy to bend. So if you don't have a metal bender, this can also be done by clamping a piece of wood onto one side and then bending it over the edge of a workbench. Next I'm rolling up 2 U-shaped parts from some angle iron, which will make up the sides of the frame. So they fit around the aluminum sheet, and just to make sure the sheet stays flat against the sides, I'm sandwiching it in there by welding on some little pieces of flat bar. Before attaching the sides together, they each get a thread for mounting, and then both sides are connected using a piece of square tubing. Then I also put a few rivets in there, just for good measure. These are the hinges that will connect this to the table. Just 2 pieces of angled iron with the hole. And now I can position this whole thing on the lower cross brace here and weld on the hinges, which makes sure everything ends up in the right position. And in case you're wondering why this even has hinges instead of welding it on directly, one reason was so it can be disassembled into smaller pieces, but the other idea is that you can actually tilt the saw cage forward, just in case you ever need to get to it from under the desk for some reason. That way you can actually reach in from the front instead of accessing it from the top. You saw in the beginning that the table also has integrated lights, and that's what we're going to tackle next. So I'm removing the shelf board again to install them. I'm going to use some of these fairly common and affordable RGB strips, but instead of just sticking them on directly to the board, I'm going to use these aluminum light profiles, which are going to make this look a lot nicer. And these have frosted covers, which disperse the light a little bit better, but you can also get them with clear covers. This one on the side here is actually not going to have any LEDs in it. I'm just going to use this as a cable channel, and for that it needs 2 cutouts on the side first. Then I also painted this one black to hide it a little better. Now I can stick on the LED strips, and these are actually not just RGB, but RGBW strips, which means that in addition to the colored LEDs, they also have a dedicated white LED, in this case warm white, and that gives you a better white light when you don't want crazy colors, compared to regular RGB strips, which can only generate white-ish light by combining all 3 colors, which usually gives off a pretty unpleasant light that's not really white. The cables are going to go through the back of the table to make them invisible, and for that I need to add another hole. I always make sure to deburr these holes, but there's most likely going to be at least one comment saying this is super dangerous because it's a metal frame, but it's just LED strips that run on 12 volts, so even if one of these cables was to get cut, it's not going to electrocute anyone. And of course, now with everything finished, it's time for party desk. In all seriousness though, I'm actually not too into the whole RGB gaming look. I mostly just use the white lights, but these strips are so cheap, it simply doesn't hurt anything to get one that also has the option of going crazy with the colors. And overall, it's just extremely useful to have a nice uniform dimmable light integrated into the desk. There's only one small problem, which is that the strips generate quite a bit of glare when sitting down at the desk, but they turned out to be easy to fix by simply adding some small aluminum strips to the front, which I simply stuck on using double-sided tape, and these have just the right height to prevent any direct glare without looking very noticeable. We are almost done now, but the desk is still missing the cable access lid in the back here, so for that to be installed, I first need to add this steel divider to the tabletop, which will then hold up one side of the lid using these tabs. So to add the tabs to this piece of flat bar, I'm clamping it against the welding table because it actually isn't completely straight horizontally, which is often the case with the hot rolled steel. So by doing this, I can make sure the lid is actually going to sit flush with the tabletop. Just like before, I'm using a cutout from the same board as a spacer so that these sit at the right height. And now this can be screwed against the back of the tabletop. And then I'm also quickly gonna add a few more of those to the sides and the back. This board will be the lid, and it has a little slot in the back where you can stick your finger in to lift it out, and that can also be used to have cables go through. Here's how it gets installed, but it's still missing a few holes for another feature, because I'm going to install some USB hubs and power outlets directly into this lid. So this is what those hubs look like. You can get these in all kinds of configurations with different connections. And they usually have a mounting diameter of 60 millimeters, which is a common standard for things like office and conference desks. Lastly, I also installed some magnets into the bottom of the board so it stays in place a bit better. And I simply drilled a hole for this that's half a millimeter undersized, and then used my favorite pliers ever to just press the magnets in for a friction fit. And I also oiled the edges of the plywood parts just for good measure. There's only one thing left to do now, which is to build a solution to mount the monitor and the speakers to the back wall of the desk. So I bought this flexible wall mount here on Amazon. There's tons of different models, and this is one of the cheaper ones, but I'm quite happy with the quality. This is of course normally supposed to be mounted to a wall, so I'm going to create a sort of adapter since I specifically planned the back of the desk so the different attachments can be mounted there depending on the use case. I'm starting by just making a base plate from some flat bar, and this plate would of course look a little different depending on which model of wall mount you buy, because they come with different mounting plates, but the general principle is quite simple and can be easily adapted to mount almost anything to the desk. Now I'm just welding on an additional plate that will engage in the slot in the back. The last thing is just this little plate and 2 screws, so it's pretty easy to build this, and here's how this is installed. The idea with the slot is that you can mount accessories anywhere you want, depending on your use case, meaning you can also use a dual or triple monitor setup and just place these accessories where you need them. What's also nice is that you can still move this around after mounting it, which allows you to adjust the position a little bit, because it can be a bit tricky to figure out where this needs to sit. The last thing I want to add is some shelves for my speakers, which will also be installed into the slot. And they're quite simple, just some L-shaped pieces that will be connected with the board. And I made these to be the perfect size for my particular speakers, but of course they can be made bigger or smaller. And just like the monitor arm, these can be positioned wherever you like. And you could of course also just build more of these and use them as shelves for different things. Now that we're finally done, the whole desk has to come apart once again to be transported. There's only one last thing. I applied this special oil to all the steel pieces. I used this before in many projects, and although it's oil, the stuff dries up after about 24 hours and forms an invisible layer that protects against rust. Here's what all the parts look like disassembled, and although it's quite a bit of stuff, you can still fit this into an average sized car if you fold over the back seats. So now we're back at my apartment and it's time to do the final assembly, which only takes about 20 minutes. So the third hole here is for this retractable power strip, and I'm going to show you how that works in a second. To do the new desk justice and to get a cleaner looking setup, I also decided to ditch my previous dual monitor setup and got this 38-inch ultra-wide monitor from LG. As I said before, you can of course also install multiple monitors to the desk, and I'm also going to put links to all the gadgets I'm using here in the description. These monitor arms usually also have some kind of cable management, which makes the whole setup look even cleaner. And here's also another benefit of the back panel with the slot, because it's also where the monitor and speaker cables can simply disappear. Here's my favorite feature about this desk in action. We've probably all hit our head a few times while crawling underneath some desk trying to plug in some power supply, but thanks to the cable tray, installing everything was a breeze this time. These USB hubs also have a hole in them, so they double as a way to pass cables down into the tray. In my case, I want to keep the desk as clean as possible, so the only cable coming out here is for my phone charger. Of course, there's a bunch of cables coming out the back here, and to clean these up somewhat, I'm just sticking on some flat cable channels with double-sided tape. And that was actually the last final step, so the desk is fully set up now, which means it's time to show off the result of all this work. Before I end this video, I just want to quickly go over all the features here. So first, here's the cable management tray again. On the left, I installed a hub with 4 USB 3 ports, which are also fast charging ports. And on the right side, there's a combination hub that has 2 card readers, a USB-C port, a headphone and microphone jacks, and also another 2 USB 3 ports. I also bought this nice spiral USB cable because it doesn't look as messy as a normal cable, so I usually just keep it plugged in here, and then I always have it handy whenever I need to charge my mouse or something. And it also happens to be the right length to charge my headphones while they're hanging from the shelf. Now here's that power strip again, which also installs into one of those 60mm holes. I can simply pull this out whenever I need an outlet for something, and then when it's not in use it just disappears. I think it's a pretty neat idea and actually not too expensive, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well. You might have noticed there's also an additional light here, which is called a screen bar, and these have become quite popular in recent years. It's just a USB powered light that you can stick onto your monitor, and it projects a light in front of it, but without causing any glare or reflections in the screen. And you can also set the color temperature and brightness. And it's a great addition with this setup because it allows me to light the area in front of the screen independently from the rest. So if I want, I can use the RGB lights just as an ambient light for the background and still have a neutral light for the work area. On top of all that, this monitor also happens to have an integrated LED ring which creates all kinds of fancy effects. So with all these combined, there's a ton of ways of getting different light setups for either work or just hanging out. Then there's of course the monitor arm, which can be set up for all kinds of positions, and these always have a certain minimum gap between the screen and the wall. And that's why I designed the desk to be relatively long from front to back. This gives you a lot of freedom to set the distance from the monitor to the front edge of the desk, however you prefer it. Since there's no monitor stand or even a tabletop mounted monitor arm, whenever I need some space on the desk, I can just simply free up a huge area by just tucking the mouse and keyboard under the screen. I also now have a decent spot where my 3D printer can live and do its thing. And also a bunch of shelf space to put some office stuff and some of my dying plants. And speaking of it, if you wondered about the headphone hangers, I 3D printed those specifically for this desk. They're quite simple and you can just stick as many as you want onto the front edge of the shelf, so now my headphones also have a dedicated parking space. Another neat thing I figured out is that the front edge is also a great place to put notes and to-do lists using magnets. One last custom addition I made off screen is this microphone arm, or rather the mounting solution for it. This arm usually mounts to the desktop, but I wanted to keep that clean, so I came up with something to mount it to the shelf. I turned the cylinder here and welded it to the end of the arm, and then it goes into this block I machined, which can mount anywhere to the edge of the shelf. So when I need the microphone, I can just pull it down from above and nothing is cluttering the tabletop and there's no cables hanging anywhere. And when it's not needed, it can also be moved out of the way completely. Alright, that's it for this one. I am really glad I built this thing, and personally I think I can never go back to using a normal desk after this. And maybe I could inspire a few of you to build your own version. If you like this content, you can support me by subscribing or joining my Patreon, or by getting the plans or a shirt, or even by trolling in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching and see you next time.